All right, welcome back to the Elias Macko Show. You know, they say timing is everything. I think our next segment is just perfect timing. Now, just think back over the last year or so and how many times have we heard U.S. President Donald Trump opine about making Canada the 51st state. Now, ladies and gentlemen, he's not the first person to think of that idea. Our next guest wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of the U.S., and his failed plans to possess the Great White North. It's our pleasure to welcome Madelaine Drohan, who's the author of the book He Did Not Conquer, Benjamin Franklin's Failure to Annex Canada. Madelaine, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having me on, Elias.
I wonder, in light of everything over the weekend, with the U.S. action in Venezuela, Donald Trump once again opining on Greenland, I wonder if you have a sort of special frame of reference here when we talk about some of the ideas America has had over the years of more and more influence in the Western Hemisphere. How do you view the events of the weekend, given you've written a book on sort of the historical side of things?
Yeah, well, I guess my frame of reference and what keeps coming into my mind with Venezuela and Greenland and Panama and that is that people have forgotten that Americans had ambitions beyond their borders from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning, it was Canada. Now Venezuela could be Canada again. I don't know.
And I find that so interesting when you look on the story. I know Benjamin Franklin has some connections to Montreal as well when you look back at his history. So why don't you tell our listeners just how hard Benjamin Franklin tried to annex Canada? Just how serious was an attempt centuries ago?
I think he was very serious, and he wasn't alone all the time as well. But he, from decades, over a period of decades, he sort of built this rationale for why Canada should be part of what was in the American colonies. He wrote pieces about how the American colonists were destined to populate the continent, and then that the Americans needed it for security purposes when it was New France, and then for security purposes again when it was under Britain. But all of these, his early attempts were basically intellectual efforts on paper, things that he printed, and that. He only really got serious when in 1776, Congress asked him to come up to Montreal, to the Chateau Ramsay, actually, which has a great portrait of him there.
Wow.
And the Americans had invaded Canada. They had occupied Montreal. They had occupied Trois-Rivières, but they had failed to take Quebec City. And so Congress said, Franklin, could you go up and basically salvage the invasion? So that was the first of two serious attempts.
And you know, it's interesting. At the end of last year, we did an interview because there was an anniversary coming of that attempt to take Quebec City in the Revolutionary War. So how close did he get? How close did they get in trying to sway Canadians of the day?
Okay, well, the Canadians were mixed, from the very beginning, a bit like the people in the States pushing for independence. It wasn't everybody. The Canadians had been relatively satisfied by, Britain had passed the Quebec Act in 1774. That allowed French Canadians to practice Catholicism. It allowed the clergy to collect fees. It allowed the seigneurs to collect their fees. And so the elites in Canada were relatively satisfied with British rule. So they were preaching against Canadians rising up in support of the Americans. So that's why I say it was mixed. There was maybe a third of the French Canadians who supported or were sympathetic to the Americans, a third supported the British, and a third were in the middle. So, in a way, we're lucky, because if all the French Canadians that numbered about 100,000 at that point had risen in support of the Americans, it would have been game over. There wouldn't have been a Canada.
So this is so interesting, right? Because I was going to ask you, like, you're aware of the theory of like alternate universes. Like every decision, there's an alternate universe where this exists. Do you believe there's an alternate universe where Canada is part of the U.S.?
Sure, we came very close.
Wow.
That invasion in 1775, 1776, had they captured Quebec City, that would have been it. They would have been in control of Canada. And, they would have had to hold it as well. But that looked possible at the time. And yeah, we would have been the 14th colony at that point. Go ahead.
Just one of the things that Franklin argued, right, that there were fears of national security for the American colonies. This is one of the reasons why this would be a good thing. And I wonder if you look at the arguments made by Franklin at that time, and you juxtapose them with maybe some of the comments, and we could debate how serious they are when Donald Trump says, yeah, Canada should be the 51st state and would be great for everyone. Do you, when you juxtapose what we heard from Trump in the last year and what the arguments that Franklin made, what do you make of that? How similar are the arguments?
Well, the rhetoric is very similar, that was used at that time. And, but the danger is different. Let me put it that way. The arguments are the same, but the danger is different. I mean, when Canada was ruled by the French, so it was New France. Well, they were basically, England and France were at war. So yeah, the security factor was very important. Again, when the British got in there and they started having trouble with their American colonists, sure, the Americans thought, yeah, the Brits are going to arm the Canadians. They're going to come and attack us from the north. But now, I mean, the situation is different. There's no talk of Canada invading the U.S. They're using different excuses now.
We're with Madelaine.
Same rhetoric,
but different excuses there. With Madelaine Drohan, the author of the book He Did Not Conquer, Benjamin Franklin's Failure to Annex Canada. As you look back on how Franklin tried to get this done, what were his key mistakes? What were the mistakes he made?
Oh, that's a good one. Because let me think about that. When he came up to Montreal, I mean, he basically found that it was an unsalvageable situation. That in fact things had gotten so bad that there really wasn't anything he could have done at that point to turn the situation around. But his last attempt, which is, again, we came very close. He came very close, was in Paris when they were negotiating a peace agreement between the newly named United States and Britain. And Franklin started pushing the idea there that Britain should give Canada to the United States. It was going to be compensation for all the horrible things that the Americans said the British did during the Revolution. And so, again, it was a little bit out of his control because just as the negotiations were nearing the end, he fell ill. And two other people took over, John Jay and John Adams, and they had different priorities than Franklin had. They both would have liked to have made Canada the 14th colony at that point, but they had other things on their mind, and so there wasn't that prolonged push at the end that would have got Canada in U.S. hands.
Speaking of alternate universes, there's a universe where Britain says, you know what, take it. We don't need it. It's fine. You guys have it. Could that have happened?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It came close. The funny thing was in those negotiations, Britain didn't really want Canada. France didn't really want Canada. Yeah. But they both agreed they didn't want the Americans to have it. And so really that's how we ended up under British control. The Brits were there, so they basically were stuck with Canada at the time.
Madeleine, listen, it's fascinating stuff. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show this morning. I think we could have many a segment on, especially in a year like this, 2026, right? 250 years since the Revolutionary War. I want to thank you for coming on, Madeleine. Real pleasure discussing this morning.
Thanks for having me on.
And I'll direct our listeners to your book. It's called He Did Not Conquer, Benjamin Franklin's Failure to Annex Canada, the author, Madelaine Drohan.
I'm Dylan Playfair.
And I'm Tyler Smith.
We're putting loneliness in the penalty box by talking to some of our favorite athletes about the importance of friendship.
This is Bromance.
Bromance is brought to you by Charm Diamond Centers, proudly Canadian-owned and operated. Charm has been part of your love stories and bromances for over 50 years. And you can find Bromance on the iHeartRadio network or wherever you get your podcasts.